joining our Ask a Geologist series. So today we have a good friend of mine, Michael Sprague, and he is from Loma Linda University in California, and he will be talking to us about pterosaurs, which I'm sure we're all really excited to hear about. So without further ado, go ahead, Mike.
All right. Hey, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us today to learn about pterosaurs. So like Ria said, I'm studying at Loma Linda University way out here in California, studying pterosaurs for my PhD work. A little bit about me. I've been interested in paleontology ever since I was 3 years old. And like a lot of kids at that age, I went through a dinosaur phase, and I'm sure a lot of parents watching know exactly what I'm talking about. And I just never left. So I was running around telling my parents and my family and my friends' parents and my teachers, and everyone knew that I wanted to be a paleontologist when I grew up. I was very much the dinosaur kid in my class. Um, and here we are, 22 years later, still stuck in the dinosaur phase. But what I try to emphasize with people when I talk to them about paleontology is that there's so much more to the history of life on Earth, so much more to paleontology than just dinosaurs. In fact, when you really dig into some of the weird and wonderful groups from Earth's history, dinosaurs start to look a little boring. They're still cool, but just in comparison, I think there's cooler animals. And so I'm very excited to talk about one of those animal groups today. But before we really get into what pterosaurs are, I want to share a fun fact about myself, and that is my favorite pterosaurs. And so I can't narrow it down to just one. So one of my favorite pterosaurs has always been Jungduropterus. And when this guy is brought up, when people talk about him, he's often quickly labeled as one of the ugliest pterosaurs, which I strongly disagree with. But I think it looks pretty cool personally. But what I think everyone can agree on is that my other favorite pterosaur, Anerognathus, is just the cutest little thing to ever grace the skies. I mean, just look at it. No one can have a negative opinion on it. It's impossible. It reminds me of a little Muppet or something. So, pterosaurs, first of all, are not dinosaurs. I'm going to emphasize that a lot today. Pterosaurs are not dinosaurs. Pterosaurs were warm-blooded flying reptiles and the earliest known flying vertebrates. And they first appeared around 228 million years ago, or that's the earliest pterosaur we have is 228 million years old. And so they probably appeared a bit before that. And this is right around the time, or this isn't too long after we see the first dinosaurs show up. And they went extinct at the end of the Cretaceous period around 66 million years ago, alongside non-avian dinosaurs, giant marine reptiles, and a number of other groups. It was a pretty big extinction. But so even though we don't have any alive today, unfortunately, they were still a very successful group considering that they ruled the skies for over 150 million years. And pterosaurs were a very diverse group in terms of both size and ecology and diet and all sorts of other things. So some had wingspans of around just 1 foot. We have a juvenile pterosaur that has a wingspan of just 10 inches that would have been able to fly. And others, as you see here, had wingspans of about 35 or 36 feet and would have stood as tall as giraffes. There is also a lot of diversity in the beak shape, tooth shape, what kind of crests they have, the length of their neck and tails, and the proportion of the wings to the rest of the body. Lots and lots of diversity. And so to give you a sense of their diets, the varied diets, for example, some, like a Anerognathus here, if you can see my mouse, had small pin-like teeth, which would have been good for catching insects or little small animals. Some would have eaten hard-shelled animals like crabs or mollusks. Others ate seeds and fruits. Others would have had large toothless beaks like the famous pteranodon here and would have been used to just grab fish and swallow them whole. Some even filter fed, like flamingos or whales. And the largest pterosaurs of all, which are one of my favorite groups, would have even preyed on small dinosaurs and other, things that were the size of humans, which is pretty big prey for a pterosaur. Now, some of you may have been a little confused by the point I emphasized earlier, that pterosaurs are not dinosaurs, because a lot of people say that pterosaurs are flying dinosaurs, but this is scientifically inaccurate. It's not true. So let me explain. Here we have a phylogenetic tree, which shows the evolutionary relationships of different organisms. They're kind of like family trees. Actually, they're exactly like family trees, just kind of upside down compared to the one that might be hanging up in your living room. So in this phylogeny, the ancestors, the grandparents and great grandparents are at the bottom, and their descendants are at the top. So this may make more sense once we dive into it. So both pterosaurs and dinosaurs are reptiles, specifically a special type of reptile called archosaurs. Now, the group Archosauria so it includes pterosaurs, dinosaurs, birds, and crocodilians. And so we can kind of divide the group Archosaurs into two major branches for now. We have the crocs and not crocs. Now we're going to ignore crocs for today. They're not important right now. So within the not crocs branch, we have a group called Avemetatarsalia. Now that's a big word, but when we break it up, it's a bit simpler. So ave or aves is the scientific term for birds, and metatarsals are the bones in your foot. So Avemetatarsalia basically means all the animals that are connected to this dot, that's pterosaurs, dinosaurs, and by extension birds, have bird-like foot bones. Now this group, Avemetatarsalia, we can put kind of a break between pterosaurs and dinosaur-like animals. But both pterosaurs and these dinosaur-like animals share a common ancestor, which is Avemetatarsalia. So even though they share this common ancestor, they are not the same thing. Because only animals within this bracket here are actually called dinosaurs. And pterosaurs, as we can see, are well outside of that. So that might sound a little confusing, but the thesis statement here is that pterosaurs are not dinosaurs. Let me try one more quick analogy in case you're still struggling with the concept, because it can be kind of confusing if you're not used to looking at these diagrams. So all dinosaurs like T-Rex, Triceratops, Brontosaurus, Velociraptor, Deinonychus, whatever, all dinosaurs are like siblings, and they're here. Pterosaurs are like their cousins over here. Now, you and your cousins share the same grandparents, right? And that is like Avemetatarsalia. They're like the grandparents of both pterosaurs and dinosaurs. But and you may even share some similar traits with your cousins. You might have the same last name, or you might have a similar face shape. But you wouldn't call your cousin a brother or sister, right? Because there is separation there. So this might all sound like I'm just being pedantic and quibbling over details, but these terms are important. It's not just being pedantic, because saying pterosaurs are dinosaurs is an error that's on the same level as calling humans marsupials. So while it might be a little confusing about how exactly we got here, it's important to know that pterosaurs are not dinosaurs. So that's about as technical as I'll get today. So now I can just sit back and enjoy the anatomy of these animals. So a lot of pterosaurs had pretty big heads, especially the later pterosaurs, had enormous heads in relation to the rest of their bodies. Next time you're in a museum and you see they have like a pterosaur displayed, whether it's mounted up or on the wall or whatever, try to pay attention to how small the body really is in relation to the head. Or even the rest of the how small the torso is in relation to the body. Because when you see Anhanguera here, it looks like a big animal, has like a something like 15-foot wingspan and a head that's about 1.5 feet long. But when you look at the body itself, it's pretty small. It's like the body is the size of a rabbit or something. And their bodies were covered in a fur-like filament called pycnofibers. Now these pycnofibers, they do look kind of like fur, but are more similar in structure to feathers. But this is why a lot of modern pterosaur reconstructions you see are shaggy or furry rather than scaly. So pterosaurs had membranous wings that are largely supported by a hugely expanded fourth finger. So they had 4 fingers. They didn't have a pinky, so it was just these 4 fingers. And they had 3 fingers right here. I don't even know if that's illustrated in it or if they're just really small. And their fourth finger extended way out here. And a membrane connected from the tip of this expanded fourth finger back to somewhere on the hind limb. Now, where exactly it connected on the hind limb isn't known for every single pterosaur and probably varied between groups, kind of like we see in bats today. And they had additional membranes in front of their arms that were supported by a bone unique to pterosaurs called a pteroid bone. And this would have just provided a stiff leading edge to the wing, which is important in aerodynamics and flight. They also had a third membrane called the urotagium that connected their hind limb to their tail. Now, the membranous wing of a pterosaur might bring to mind another animal, bats. However, while bat membranes are little more than just blood vessels and a couple layers of elastic skin and a little muscle, pterosaur wing membranes were thicker, stronger, and more complex. They being composed of skin, a vascular system, veins and blood vessels, sheets of muscle, and a unique structure called actinofibers or actinofibrils. Actinofibers were hair-thin fibers that are made of keratin, which is the same material that makes up fingernails and hair and the horns of some animals. And these actinofibers ran along the length of their wing, front to back, and this would have just given the wing some extra strength. There's been a lot of research into how pterosaurs got off the ground. And it was originally thought by some paleontologists that, like birds, pterosaurs were primarily bipedal, and they took off like birds by jumping off the ground and just flapping with their wings. However, we now know that pterosaurs engaged in what's called a quadrupedal launch. That is, their front limbs kind of did all the heavy lifting, and they kind of vaulted off with their arms. And we even think they'd be able to do this, take off on the water like this, because we have evidence that some pterosaurs were spending a lot of time foraging on the water or even in the water. Now here's a video to show quadrupedal launch in action in case you're still a little confused by the concept. So to take off, they would be standing on all 4 feet, and they would crouch down, store up some energy, and then they would leap off with their hind limbs and use their front limbs to kind of vault and launch off the ground. So their hands were the last thing to leave the ground, and then they would have started flapping. So here it is a little smoother. Okay. So studying pterosaur fossils isn't always as easy as studying larger animals, because most pterosaur fossils honestly look like roadkill. And this is because, like birds, pterosaurs have extraordinarily thin bone walls. So look how thin the wall of the bone around it is compared to the thickness of the bone itself. And they would have like cross struts in it in life that would have given it some extra strength, but they still get crushed pretty easily as fossils. Because, yeah, I mean, pterosaurs just don't survive the fossilization process as well as bigger animals, because the fossilization process involves, after the animal dies, it can be scavenged, transported, stepped on, buried, and crushed and smushed. And so these delicate bones don't survive that as well as, say, a 5-foot long leg bone of a brontosaurus. And this is also partially why we know about just under 200 species of pterosaur compared to the well over 1,000 species of dinosaur. They weren't necessarily less rare in life, but the fossil record is biased towards things that get preserved more easily. However, we do have some pterosaur specimens that are preserved with lots of detail. So certain rock formations, such as places in Germany or Brazil, they preserve fossils extremely well. And this reveals structures like wing membranes in Rhamphorhynchus or tail veins. So we know Rhamphorhynchus and relatives had a little flap of skin on the tail. Um, we have soft tissue crests that would have run between these bony struts, like in tupandactyls here. And we even have pterosaur eggs that are preserved with baby pterosaurs inside, which is really cool. So pterosaurs would have had soft-shelled eggs like a lot of reptiles today do. Now, speaking of soft tissue, we've long known that pterosaurs were covered in pycnofibers. However, in 2019, paleontologists discovered well-preserved pterosaur fossils in China with branching pycnofibers. This is significant because if we saw these same structures in dinosaurs, we'd probably call them protofeathers. So this suggests that one of two options. Either one, pterosaurs evolved a structure similar to feathers independently of dinosaurs and birds, but they weren't technically feathers, they just kind of looked like it. Or two, that feathers are ancestral to the common ancestors of both pterosaurs and dinosaurs. Now, there's some debate on whether, like, which one is the case. I personally suspect it's the second option, that the great-great-grandpa of pterosaurs and dinosaurs had feathers or some kind of filament-like integument. In fact, it's possible that the common ancestor of the crocs and not croc branches that we saw earlier, it's possible that the ancestor of crocs and pterosaurs and dinosaurs had feathers or feather-like filaments, because modern crocodiles actually have an inactive gene for feather development. Now, we can't make crocodiles grow feathers. We've tried, apparently, but they still have a gene that codes for that. It's just, a leftover. So another big unsolved puzzle in pterosaur research is what sort of animal they evolved from. Their origins are still shrouded in mystery. So basically, in other words, in terms of transitional pterosaurs, we have no transitional pterosaurs. For a couple of decades, at least, we thought we had at least an idea of the sort of animal pterosaurs may have evolved from, and that was a little hopping animal called Scleromochlus. But a paper in 2019, or actually this year, just in February, a few months ago, a paper came out that said, "Oh, this animal wasn't, it didn't quite operate the way we thought it did, and so it's not even close to ancestral pterosaurs." And so that put us back to square one. So we still have no idea what pterosaurs came from. We don't know how they got off the ground in the first place, because the earliest pterosaurs we have were very capable flyers. They looked like pterosaurs. Now, my PhD research focuses on pterosaurs from the Morrison Formation. The Morrison Formation is a geologic unit that was being deposited during the late Jurassic period, around 150 million years ago. Today you can find fossils from the Morrison in places like Utah, Colorado, and Wyoming. That's where all the pterosaur fossils that I study come from. And these pterosaurs would have lived alongside famous dinosaurs like Allosaurus, Brontosaurus, and Stegosaurus, but it was a very diverse ecosystem. It had a lot more than just dinosaurs. It had, pterosaurs, obviously, and mammals, salamanders, lizards, fish, all kinds of things, birds. And because pterosaur bones are so rare, especially in the Morrison Formation, a lot of my research takes place in museum collections. Now, what are museum collections? So museums aren't able to display every single bone that they have on hand. There's just not enough room. So they have these big collection rooms where they store fossils. So paleontologists like me can come to research them. So this is at Brigham Young University in Utah. I pull out a drawer and there's just an Allosaurus muzzle staring me in the face. They're really cool places. And museum collections are a very, very important part of paleontology. And sometimes the most fascinating discoveries can be made from bones that have been sitting in a drawer and forgotten about for 70 years. Here's another image from Brigham Young. They have a bunch of Camarasaurus, that's a long-necked dinosaur, some backbones just sitting on the shelf. Every time I walk into a collections room for part of my research, I just take a few seconds and look around and think, I made the right career choice. No. So here I am doing some of my research. So up in the upper left corner, I'm looking at a fragment of pterosaur jaw, and just for some reference so you can have a sense of how scrappy the remains are I deal with, this jawbone is the most complete pterosaur fragment from the Morrison Formation. Just, I mean, something that's smaller than my hand. And so we're looking at the roof of the mouth here. None of the teeth are preserved. On the upper right, I am sketching a humerus, a large pterosaur humerus in my handy dandy field book, so I can reference it later. In the lower left, I'm doing the same thing. I'm at Brigham Young University and just pulled out all the tiny little pterosaur bones they had. And I'm just going through and sketching each one and making notes on them. And in the lower right, one of my colleagues is comparing the pterosaur humerus I'm sketching up above to a photo of a pterosaur humerus from England, I believe, or the UK. And so that's what part of my research entails, is comparing pterosaurs from the US to pterosaurs from Germany and other places in Europe and Africa and China. So why study pterosaurs? Well, like paleontology in general, studying these things tells us more about the history of life on Earth. It reveals evolutionary trends and relationships. And I mean, it's just interesting. And I think most people are fascinated by this stuff. Because if you go to, museums are often pretty crowded, especially the dinosaur hall. People, like everyone loves learning about these things. And there's still a lot left to learn about these animals. So what color were they? How did they interact with other species in their ecosystem? What were the diets of certain groups? Were there flightless pterosaurs? How did they breed? How many eggs could different species have? There's always more research to do. Fossils need to be described. Relationships need to be unraveled. I'm doing both of those things for my PhD work. And the origins of pterosaurs themselves are still a huge question mark. So with that, that's what I have for you today, and I can now open up to questions. I'll stop sharing my screen here. Okay. So Mary from Scotch Plains asks, do we know if they laid eggs, and if so, how many and where? Whether it was in the ground or trees or underground or mounds. So yeah, we do know pterosaurs laid eggs like reptiles. And like I said, there would have been soft-shelled eggs like turtles or lizards. And there is a pterosaur called Hemipterus, the egg I showed earlier, is from China. And we found a huge nesting site that probably would have had hundreds of individuals in it, hundreds of individual pterosaurs, and probably thousands of eggs. So at least some pterosaurs would have congregated and during breeding season and laid, an egg clutches or a clutch of eggs that are, maybe a dozen or so, or 2 dozen. Other pterosaurs were smaller and probably only laid 1 or 2 eggs at the time. We actually have a pterosaur fossil, I think it's Darwinopterus, that is preserved with an egg, like what single egg right beside it. Mary also asks, can you tell males from females? Another good question. So we do have some evidence for sexual dimorphism in pterosaurs, specifically Pteranodon, which is one of the most famous species of pterosaur, probably the most famous species. So Pteranodon has a long pointed crest on the back of the head that looks kind of like a dunce cap. And we've noticed in some specimens, the crest is shorter than in other specimens. Now, some of this is just juvenile specimens, but even in the adults, we think the males had larger crests, And then also some of the specimens with shorter crusts had very wide hip bones, which would have given more room. We think those are females, and that would have given more room to for the eggs to pass through. Ryan from Lenoka Harbor, New Jersey, would like to know, how did pterosaurs evolve fur and perhaps even warm-bloodedness separate from the mammalian chassis? This is another good question. So I'm far from an expert in the evolution of endothermy, that's warm-bloodedness. But we do see endothermy arise in several different groups. It's not unique to, mammals and birds. So just off the top of my head, mammals and birds obviously have it. Dinosaurs were mostly warm-blooded, at least mostly. Pterosaurs were warm-blooded. Some sharks and turtles and tuna are all warm-blooded. Even some insects are endothermic. Endothermy has arisen several times in the history of life. How exactly that happens, I would say it's just because they needed lots of energy, and endothermy is the best way to accomplish that. So it's different solutions to the same problem. Ria's mom would like to know how pterosaurs balanced or aligned their bodies going from standing position into flying. So, like we said earlier, pterosaurs, a lot of them have pretty big heads, and it's interesting trying to figure out how exactly to balance that massive head with the rest of the body, especially when taking off or landing. But when you look at pterosaur skulls, a lot of them have massive nares. That's the hole where the nose is, and other holes in the skull that would have dramatically reduced how much the skull weighs. And so even early pterosaurs like Dimorphodon, which is kind of a wide-headed or tall-skulled pterosaur, it had pretty big openings in its head. And early pterosaurs also would have had long tails, which helped balance out the animal as well. Matthew would like to know, are pterodactyls considered to be pterosaurs? So yeah, pterosaurs are often referred to in popular culture by most people as pterodactyls, but pterodactyls is not the proper term for every single pterosaur. Pterodactyl or pterodactyloids refers to a specific group of pterosaurs, and that's going to be the later pterosaurs with short tails. So if you see a pterosaur with a short tail, you can call that a pterodactyl. Or even better, there's a specific pterosaur called Pterodactylus from Germany from the Jurassic period. And that's kind of where the name pterodactyl originated. But not all pterosaurs are actually pterodactyls. The more proper term is pterosaur. Gabriel from North Plainfield would like to know, what is a predator of the pterosaurs? Another good question. So probably other pterosaurs and dinosaurs. We actually have fossils from, was it Brazil or Africa? It's either South America or Africa, where we have pterosaur fossils that have tooth scrape marks from an animal like Spinosaurus. So we don't know if Spinosaurus was actually would have been catching it out of the air, or if it would have just scavenged a carcass. But any carnivore of the time that was big enough probably preyed on pterosaurs. So carnivorous dinosaurs and other pterosaurs were probably a big one. Maybe some of the bigger mammals during the Jurassic period, if they could catch a pterosaur. So how would they hold up their heads if their skulls were so big compared to their bodies? Like we talked about, they had lots of big holes in their heads to reduce weight. And all their bones were hollow too, which helps reduce weight even more. Leela would like to know, what is my favorite pterosaur joke? I don't know if I know any pterosaur jokes. If you have any good pterosaur jokes, let me know. I'd love to hear them. I do like pterosaur puns though, including putting peas in front of silent peas in front of peas. So like my shirt says Team Pterosaur or Pateam Pterosaur. Um, I use that kind of pun a lot in presentations. I don't get tired of it. Everyone else probably does.
I know a pterosaur joke, Mike.
Okay, go for it, Ria.
It's why can't you hear the pterodactyl go to the bathroom? Because the P is silent.
That's a good one. Do you think the heat in the nests would determine the gender as happens with some reptiles? Also from Leela. That's another good question. I don't know. It's possible, but yeah, I don't know much about temperature dependent sex determination. So I can't speak authoritatively on that topic. And I mean, a lot of these animals, like these extinct animals, like pterosaurs that we don't have good modern analogs to, it's just kind of impossible to say. Carol Drews would like to know where is the Morrison Formation and what type of rock is it? So the Morrison Formation outcrops in a lot of the western United States, including Utah, Colorado, and Wyoming, some in New Mexico and Arizona. I think it even gets into the Dakotas a little bit, and maybe up into Montana. And it's mostly sandstones and limestones. And I've done some different digs in different places. And so I've done digs in the Lance Formation in Wyoming. This is Upper Cretaceous stuff where we find T-Rex and Triceratops. And the Lance Formation is basically sandy soil. But when I started digging in the Morrison Formation, it was like my worst nightmare, where the rock is like the same consistency as the fossil, and it can be very tricky to get the fossil out without breaking it. Don Monteverde would like to know if you were to create a movie like Jurassic Park, which pterosaur do you think would scare the average person the most? So, if I was building a Jurassic Park, I wouldn't be trying to scare people because pterosaurs and dinosaurs were not movie monsters, they were just animals. That being said, there were some pterosaurs that I wouldn't want to mess with. I think the scariest pterosaur would, without question, be one of the Asdarchid pterosaurs, like Quetzalcoatlus or Hatzegopteryx. The picture I showed in the beginning of the presentation that stood as tall as giraffes and had heads that were 8 to 10 feet long. Those would be very frightening animals in real life, without question. So definitely some kind of Asdarchid. Are there any species alive today? Also, this is also from Don. Are there any species alive today that were on the same branch of the evolutionary tree as pterosaurs? So there are no close relatives of pterosaurs living today. The closest relative would be birds. And like we mentioned earlier, birds are dinosaurs. And dinosaurs are pretty, there's a pretty big separation between dinosaurs and pterosaurs. So birds would be the closest relative. And the next closest relative would be crocodilians. So unfortunately, we really have nothing like pterosaurs alive today, which is a shame. Isla Cooper from Hazlet, New Jersey would like to know, could some birds or bats have DNA from pterosaurs? So short answer, no. Long answer, bats are mammals, so they are very, very, very far removed from pterosaurs. The common ancestor of bats and pterosaurs would have been the common ancestor of reptiles and mammals. And this is way before the dinosaurs or pterosaurs showed up. And birds, like I just discussed a minute ago, they're the closest common ancestor, but they're still a really far cry from pterosaurs. And so, the question you might have is like, well, all these things can fly. Are they related? But these are just different solutions to the same problem. They want to fly, and so some animals get membrane wings. Some animals grow feathers, and that's how they fly. And that's an example of convergent evolution. Roy White would like to know, What changes took place in pterosaurs over the course of the Mesozoic? This is another good question. So the earliest pterosaurs had what we call heterodont teeth. That means at least two different shapes of teeth in their mouths. And later pterosaurs changed to homodont teeth, which is all the teeth look basically the same. And most of the latest pterosaurs didn't have teeth at all. They just had long, toothless beaks. Early pterosaurs also had different proportions of their wings. They had shorter wings in comparison to their bodies, and they had long tails. And I don't know of any late Cretaceous pterosaur that had long tails. So long tails was a very early characteristic. And the proportions of the hind feet also kind of grew smaller as they evolved. Parker from Dayton, Tennessee would like to know, when did pterosaurs appear in the fossil record, and are there any new theories about what it might have evolved from? So yeah, this is exactly what we discussed. The earliest pterosaur is Ciazodactylus from Italy. I think it's Italy, about 228 million years ago. And so they probably evolved. That's just the first one we have. They probably appeared far earlier. And what they evolved from, I would love to know. So every year, like some paleontologists, including me, have kind of like a wish list in their heads about what kind of paleontological discoveries we would want to make this year, or someone to make like this year. And every single year, without fail, the top of my list is a transitional pterosaur. That's all I want. Sarah would like to know, do the fossil feet of pterosaurs seem to show that they perched like birds? So it's been a bit since I reviewed the literature on this, but if I remember correctly, pterosaurs, they didn't have grasping feet. So like uh, in Jurassic World, this movie is so ridiculous. When the helicopter breaks through the aviary and the pterosaurs all fly out and go immediately to attacking people, um, and some of the pterosaurs actually grab people and pick them up. They couldn't do that. Their feet cannot grasp like birds, and so they wouldn't be able to hang like bats or perch on narrow branches like birds would have been able to, or birds are able to. Gabriel from North Plainfield would like to know, is a flying squirrel related to pterosaurs? So this is another example of convergence, kind of. So flying squirrels don't actually fly, they glide. And flying squirrels are mammals, like bats. But again, bats and flying squirrels and pterosaurs and birds, they all evolved flight or gliding independently of one another. And that reminds me of another good question. Speaking of flying squirrels and gliding, um, is that a lot of people speculate that flying animals evolved from gliding animals, because it seems like a reasonable transition where you get from land-based to gliding to flying. But other people disagree with that, because gliding and flying are require pretty different physical forms. Isla Cooper from Hazlet, New Jersey would like to know, where does the word paleontology comes from? So the word paleontology comes from the Greek paleos, meaning old or ancient, and ology, which is to study. And so paleontology basically means the study of ancient life. How much force did the pterosaurs need to make lift off like that? Are there any animals that do anything similar to this in the modern age or the past? So, as I don't know the figures offhand, physics is not my forte, so I don't really remember all the exact numbers and everything. But Mark Witten and Mike Habib have written papers on this about how pterosaurs took off. There's lots of scientific literature about pterosaurs taking off if you want to really learn more about that. Lots and lots of material is available for that. And is there anything that does something similar to this? Bats, kind of. Bats do kind of a quadrupedal launch. So there's some good studies on this comparing them to pterosaurs and some videos of bats in slow motion where you can see bats kind of using their hands or their arms to launch off the ground. But bats are still a little different than pterosaurs. So pterosaurs, remember, are they have three little fingers and then one huge finger, while bat hands are basically just like a human hand but really spread out. And the membrane stretches between all the fingers rather than from the tip of the finger to the body like we see in pterosaurs. So they are, even if they might look kind of similar, they are pretty different. Was sleeping compatible with flying for pterosaurs like it is for some modern birds today? That's an interesting question. I actually haven't heard that one before or thought about it. So just speculating here, maybe. So we know pterosaur brains. We can analyze the shape of their brains and tell that they had adaptations to flying like modern birds do. Like a big, the certain parts of the brain were enlarged that would have helped during flying. And so I don't know if birds have like enlarged center, like birds that can sleep while flying have enlarged like certain brain centers compared to other birds. But if they do, that could be something we could look into and compare with pterosaurs. Now, I could see very large pterosaurs like the soaring pterosaurs, like Quetzalcoatlus, traveling that would have traveled thousands of miles. Maybe they could have slept while flying. But a lot of pterosaurs also, especially the big ones, could have covered a lot more ground faster than modern birds do. So I asked Mark Whitten once, he's a famous pterosaur researcher, what the fastest ground speed some pterosaurs could reach. And he speculated that Asdarchids, the big 40-foot wingspan pterosaurs, could have had ground speeds of like 100 miles an hour while flying through the air, which is flying, literally. Why did you want to study pterosaurs? Okay, so when I first got to Loma Linda and started my PhD research, I was actually interested in studying whale evolution. That's something that's always fascinated me. But then my advisor and friend, who I've known for several years, he texted me and was like, he teaches just at a school a couple hours north of Loma Linda. But he texted me and asked like, "Are you married to the idea of studying fossil whales?" And I'm like, not really. Why? And he was like, "Do you want to study pterosaurs?" And I was like, "Sure." So that's how my PhD project was decided over text, as all the great ones are. But I've always been interested in pterosaurs. They're really cool animals, and as I learn more about them, I know the more fascinating I find them. And they're not something that a lot of people know tons about, like is the case with dinosaurs. So it's just an interesting topic for lay people and scientists alike. How did pterosaurs land? So basically, they would, as they approached the ground, as I understand, as they approached the ground, they would have slowed themselves with their wings and then just kind of plopped down, or maybe like touched with their hind limbs first before actually touching down with their front limbs. Um, I was trying to think of a modern analog, but there isn't a modern analog for pterosaurs. And it was Don who asked that question. How wide was the wingspan of Quetzalcoatlus from Gabriel of North Plainfield? So Quetzalcoatlus had a wingspan of about 35 or 36 feet. And then, or maybe a little less than that. And then Hatzegopteryx was a related species that had a similar wingspan. So these were, absolutely monstrous animals. I mean, almost 40 feet. That's the size of a World War II bomber. Where have you traveled for your studies? So most of my research is being done in museums, like I said. And so I've been to Brigham Young University in Utah, near Salt Lake City. I've been to Ogden, Utah, which is, I think it's like southeast of Utah, or southeast of Salt Lake City, if I remember right. And I also have a field site of the Morrison Formation in Colorado. That's not too far. It's actually the same rock strata as Dinosaur National Monument. Could they dive? And if so, how deep could they go? So yeah, we do think at least some pterosaurs had the capability to dive and probably did dive for fish and other marine morsels that they would have eaten. Um, how deep they could have gone, I don't know offhand. Probably not terribly deep. But there is a pterosaur called, it starts with an A. I don't remember the exact name of it. But it was a nyctosaur, NYCT OSAURID. Um, and nyctosaurs were related to pteranodon and a species like that. And so we think pteranodon and nyctosaurids would have lived on like coastal environments and spent a lot of time on or near the oceans or the inland sea at that time. Um, but this pterosaur, this nyctosaurid I'm trying to think of, we actually think it would have spent a lot of time like sitting on top of the water, and it seems to have adaptations for kind of swimming around a little bit and paddling around. Which that was actually when pterosaurs were first discovered in the 1870s. They were interpreted to be aquatic animals that use their big arms to paddle rather than fly. Where did I get my T-shirt? I got my T-shirt at the Los Angeles County Natural History Museum. So if you're ever out in California, or if you're watching now and you're in California, visit the museum when it opens back up. It's a really good museum and has some pterosaur bones. Wish it would have more, but I think there's some questions in the chat. So Mary from New Jersey asks, what caused them to become extinct? Probably the same thing. They probably went extinct for the same reasons that a lot of other large reptiles at the time went extinct. So the Cretaceous extinction, 66 million years ago, most people know about the giant 6 mile wide meteor that hit the Gulf of Mexico. But also going on around that time, maybe just before or just after, were massive amounts of volcanism happening in India. These are called the Deccan traps, Deccan traps. And these have just been massive lava fields that would have drastically altered the climate of the Earth. So the Cretaceous extinction was likely caused by those two things primarily. And but like a lot of things, it wasn't just, it wasn't that simple. There's probably a lot of things going on that led to their demise. But we do see a lot of large reptiles, dinosaurs, pterosaurs, and then all the marine reptiles like mosasaurs and plesiosaurs and ichthyosaurs are all wiped out at the end of the Cretaceous. So they, those conditions probably were just negatively affected larger body sizes. So yeah, it wasn't necessarily so much the fact that they were reptiles, because they were very different than reptiles we think of today, warm-blooded, feathers, etc. But a lot of these animals were very big, and the Cretaceous extinction tended to wipe out all the big things. And then as for the smaller pterosaurs, they might have been outcompeted by birds after when they were struggling to recuperate from the extinction. Just looking through these messages. Okay, so we can go back up to some of more of Mary's questions. There are a number of good ones. So let's see. Oh, this is a fun one. What instruments or tools would you like to invent to help your research? Uh, I don't know. So I'm not so well versed on the technical side. So my answer would be a time machine, so I can go back and find out what the heck an ancestral pterosaur looked like. But that's probably a pipe dream. I'm not putting too many eggs in that basket. Were there any big changes in anatomy, like a new bone or new position of a bone, that occurred during the time of the pterosaurs? So yeah, so there's the pteroid bone that's in the front of the arm that would have supported the leading edge of the wing. That the pteroid bone is unique to pterosaurs, and they the finger the wing structure is pretty unique too. So they have those three little fingers and one enormous ring finger. Um, so I can't think of many other animals that have, you know, a drastically increased finger unless it was for food acquisition. Like some dinosaurs and primates have long fingers like that for getting bugs in trees, but they don't use it to fly, as far as I know.
Okay, Mike, I think those were all the questions we had today. So
Okay.
thank you so much for doing this. And thank you to all of our listeners for tuning in today. Don't forget to tune in next Tuesday on I believe it is June 2nd, to hear Dr. Sonia Tiku Shantz. She's an assistant professor of geophysics at Stanford University, and she will be talking to us about meteorites. So be sure to check that out. And thanks again, Mike.
Yeah, thank you for inviting me, and thank all of you for joining us.